Welcome everyone to another Mentor Core event. Today we're very excited to have Jared Knapp joining us, and we're going to be talking about all things trade, sanctions, everything from cornfields to missiles and everything in between. But before we get to that, we want to remind you that Mentor Core is a community for compliance, security, and risk professionals to meet each other, know and grow along the way. And we're thrilled to have you here today. We really enjoy these sessions where we've gotten to know so many people from many different disciplines and hear about their journeys and what they've learned along the way. My name is Lisa Beth Lentini Walker. I am a compliance, ethics, and corporate governance strategist, and I run the firm Lumen Worldwide Endeavors, but my passion work is really around Mentor Core, and I am thrilled that I get to work on Mentor Core every day with my buddy Dan.
Hey, Lisa Beth, how's it going?
It's going great.
Good. I'm glad. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Really glad you're here. We've got a great discussion today. I'm Dan Ayala. As Lisa Beth said, I'm a founder of Socratic, a strategic security and privacy consultancy. But in the same way, just like Lisa Beth said, mentoring and helping people grow in these careers is so important to me and to us, which is why we're so excited to have both Mentor Core in this discussion today. And really great to have Jared here. Hey, Jared, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you, Dan?
Very good, thanks. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity as well.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. We have had a lot of people ask about getting into the profession that you're in. But before we get there, tell us a little bit about you. Who is Jared Knapp?
Absolutely. So as you guys probably saw from the title, cornfields to national security missiles and et cetera, I think it's important to point out that I'm from a very small town originally growing up. That's where cornfields is coming, Indiana. Everybody thinks about cornfields. In fact, I have discussions with people from the East Coast, from Europe. Everybody looks at a map, they see Indiana in the middle of nowhere, and they're like, what about Chicago, LA, all the other big cities? Growing up, some of my first jobs were baling hay, straw, and helping my grandpa feed cattle. Why that's important? Because everybody's like, who cares? Like if you're coming from a small town or not. First of all, I had no idea about a lot of these jobs that were out there, whether it's compliance, but also thinking about working with missiles and national defense and export compliance was never something that was on the front of my mind. In my community, it was never really a forefront thought or anything that was ever discussed, even trade policy, anything along those lines. So it's important to remember, like, just like you guys, I had no idea about these fields, and that's why it's very important to have discussions with as many people as possible in the fields that you're interested in, because compliance is a whole bunch of different fields: trade, healthcare, pharmacy. I mean, you can go on down the line. So having those discussions is really important. Going from my small town, I went to Indiana University for my bachelor's, and that kind of opened my mind up a little bit to some areas that I wanted to explore. So including being away from a smaller town atmosphere with this huge campus with all these students now from different areas across the US, I was like, oh, wow, you guys are thinking about this. That's interesting. Eventually, they got me on the compliance route, which got me thinking, okay, what's compliance? What do I want to do with compliance? How do I go from there? Naturally, I turned to, I guess, law school at the time, because it's like, oh, a lot of legal elements to it, which took me from Indiana to Minnesota. And now all of a sudden, I've gone from a small town in Indiana, staying in the state, to now Minnesota doing law school, which is, I felt like even a smaller fish in a bigger pond, because now I'm in a very diverse area. And I think if a lot of people who live in Minnesota, they feel like it's pretty diverse compared to a lot of spots in Indiana in terms of cultures, where people have come from, ideas, businesses, and the compliance community, very strong in the Twin Cities with the law schools there. So during my law school route, I focused mainly on healthcare compliance because that was a big fundamental program of Hamlin at the time, which is now combined for law schools. But I mean, it was mainly focused on there. All my internships, externships there, connections started out in healthcare compliance. I was like, this is what I got to do. I got to be in healthcare compliance. After I got out of law school, I started doing the normal, looking for jobs in healthcare compliance, being somebody with a JD, you know, trying to break in, trying to understand how that looks. And lo and behold, I had a connection and applied for a job in trade compliance, which I had no idea about at the time. And the first job that I actually interviewed for Honeywell at the time, I didn't get the first job. So I had gone through a lot of the rounds and met a lot of the team there. Didn't get the first job, but I was fortunate enough through the interview process, they had opened up another role in Minnesota at the same time, and they pushed me forward for that role. And that kicked off my experience in the wonderful world of export and sanctions compliance.
So when you were interviewing for that job at Honeywell that you didn't get, did you let the people who were you were talking with say, you know, did you tell them, hey, I'd be really interested in any role that this company has? Was it company specific, or was it just, you know, think about me if there's something that comes up in the future? Like, how did you navigate that? Because I know a lot of people struggle with that.
Yeah, the main thing I did was, one, make sure that I'm, you know, very cordial during the experience. It's easy to get discouraged, especially if you feel like there may be a chance that you're not going to get a position. Let's face it, a lot of times we get interviews, but then it's very clear, I guess, after the first one, like maybe you're not qualified, or maybe they just weren't feeling you, right? Interviews can be a
Right.
scary experience for anybody. Uh, if you have a bad day, you may have a bad interview. Yeah, it's a very complicated process, but just being upfront with them and just showing my personality at each interview and just telling them, like, look, I love what you guys are doing. I'm very interested in this space, showing I have that interest. And then at the end of it, like you said, after my last interview, I was like, look, you know, even if you guys don't consider me for this role, I'd be very interested in the future if you have another role available. And that ended up working and staying connection there.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That's great,
So,
especially because I
yeah.
know many people feel they say that, you know, they say that at the end of an interview and then feels like it goes off into the ether. So it is nice to hear a story in which it actually played out, you know, that whole I'll keep your resume on file thing, or
Right.
which is mythical. So thank you for sharing that. I know a lot of people will take confidence in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, let me take you back again to you're in Indiana.
Yep.
W- You're getting your bachelor's, presumably not in compliance.
Right.
Um,
Right.
what was getting your bachelor's like? What about getting your bachelor's led you to be interested in the compliance space? Because I don't know of a lot of people who are figuring this out in their bachelor's.
Yeah. So I was actually doing some coursework in labor and employment relations, actually, believe it or not. And within that area and a lot of the courses, compliance came up because of
Hmm.
work with unions and things and labor employment issues in general. So it wasn't even healthcare compliance. That was the first one that came up. But I saw it as, within the coursework, we had an individual who was a chief compliance officer for a union, actually, and they were telling us how the field in their eyes was starting to grow, not in their area, but compliance in general.
Hmm.
And so that was one of the things, the combination of the interpretation, but the business side of it as well. I never really wanted to get into sales or marketing, I guess, at that point. Although internally you're often selling, you know, compliance initiatives anyways. But I thought that just kind of struck a chord with my personality and what I was looking for. And, you know, once you start deep diving into something and going further down the rabbit hole, all of a sudden you're hooked. So that's kind of what started it at the bachelor level.
That's amazing. And I will say, you know, personally, I had never considered compliance. It wasn't actually a thing when I was, getting my bachelor's degree. So I had never met anyone who had done compliance until much later in my career. So it's amazing that we're starting to connect with people who are starting in their careers and starting to get their higher education, and being able to be a kind of an influence for good. So
Yeah.
we,
And
yeah,
staying open as you and staying
right.
keeping your mind open as you're going into school. I know a lot of kids. I have a child who's starting to get close to high school and to the end of high school, and the prevailing thought is go into college thinking you know what you want to be, but
No, no.
I'm not doing what I went into college, what I thought I would be doing. um
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
just that reminder to stay open through it and see what interests you as you go, and that it makes sense when we hear it. It makes sense by default, but when you hear it, it kind of reminds you need to remember it.
Right. And I would say compliance still, I think you fall into two categories, when you ask people how they fell into it. One is by accident. And that's still, you still have a lot of people, they were in finance or shipping or something else. And there was a compliance issue that popped up. The company says, hey, can you help out? And now all of a sudden that
Right.
person's in the world of compliance. I think you still have a lot of that, but you're starting to see a shift too. And now a lot of people who are seeking it out as a career because they're seeing the explosion and the opportunities there, whether it's from the legal side or people in the business who are interested in pursuing a new route. So it's kind of interesting to see how that changed. Even in my 6 years in trade, I've seen a shift in that. You're starting to see a lot of younger career-oriented people move into compliance because they're seeking it out. And it's like, that's cool that you're starting to see that change as well.
Right. And the idea of the ethics buyer and the values buyer being a true business driver is being taught in business schools now. So you're seeing
Yeah.
people hearing about the fact that this is actually driving business in
Right.
a very material way. And that's encouraging as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what with for example, in our industry, China and supply chain issues, for certain areas, it's the battle of, the trade-off for businesses. Do we live by this ethical culture, or do we continue to do business in these areas and risk being seen a reputational harm or other issues as well? So it's interesting to see how it's become more on the front of the mind of companies, but it's still a very difficult evaluation there, especially when you're getting into the business. So
Yeah, so we got a question already, which
okay.
is exciting. So the question is, do you have any thoughts on how to demonstrably show that you're really interested in the company, like really, really interested in the company? So this is beyond just the platitude of like, I'm really passionate about what you do, or anything that becomes really cliche and questionably sincere is what was in the question. So what are those recommended approaches for showing there really is a genuine interest in other opportunities if the one that you're going for doesn't work out?
Okay. Yeah, this goes back to, I think, my idea of networking as well, that I figured out after I entered my first job. So this is stuff that I wish I would have kind of known. First off, is start early. Start showing that passion early on, because and this is the same whether you're trying to build a network or build a following in anything that you're doing. If I come to you tomorrow and say, hey, out of the blue, hey, I'm really interested in your company, I really want to be involved with compliance or anything like that, it's not going to come off as a genuine approach, compared to if they see this, that you've been building the interest and starting early, months in advance, and they can see a pattern. Then they're going to be like, okay, yeah, I see this as a genuine approach. I know they actually care, and they're going to take your words at more value. And so I think that's really important. And what you're starting to see, there's a lot of people that are reaching out for jobs, right? So it becomes more and more complicated for people. If their time is being taken up, they see these messages and they're like, well, I don't know you, or I don't see anything about your past that shows that you have any interest. They're not going to necessarily take that truth. But if they can look at you and say, look, I can look back, even 2, 3, 4 months ago, and I can see this interest, they're like, okay, maybe this person's really, really preaching what they're saying. So I think start early is my best advice. and then they'll be able to go along with that.
Is there any risk in applying that to more than one area at a time? You almost have to do, is putting that level of passion around 4 or 5 or 6, does it become disingenuous at that point?
I think you could risk that. It's the scatter shot approach, right? Of saying, hey, I'm interested in this, and this. If you get too broad with it, I think you do have an issue of watering that down. I also think it may depend on where you are in your career, and because if you're, for example, if you're just coming out of school, maybe it's a little more understandable for people to say, well, they're still trying to figure some things out. I see they have passions in different areas. It's good to see that they're taking the approach of, seeking out those passions and learning. So if you're at that point, then I think it's a little less worrisome compared to if you're maybe a little more further down in your career and all of a sudden you have 10, it may be a little concerning at that point of, maybe I don't know if they're really interested in this area or seeking out other ones.
Makes sense. So you start your first role.
Yep.
And does your first role resemble what you're doing now, or was it different?
It's similar. So when I started out, it was a very foundational building approach, and it was I was starting fresh in the regulations, starting fresh in the industry, and it was actually funny. It was a huge wake-up call for me, actually, when my first day there, the site director set me down. He had this serious tone, and he said, look, the product that we make, it helps keep people in the service safe. And I'm talking about military service, and that was kind of an eye-opener for me, because I was like, wow, what I'm getting into can matter to that type of level. But it was very much just learning the regulations that we were working within, from a very base level. What are the requirements? What are you going to be concerned with moving forward? How do our policies and procedures fit into this? Really understanding how that industry's compliance type framework works. So now all of a sudden I have a base. And then when I was at Honeywell and moving within the company and higher up and taking on more responsibilities, it was moving from that base to more advanced projects. And I would say the best way to explain it is moving from maybe the lesser risk areas of the company. And as you gain more confidence and they gain confidence in you, they're going to place you in projects that are at the higher risk levels because they have that confidence in you. And when you start to see that within your compliance journey or any role, then that's giving you a really good idea of what you're doing is you're starting to stretch yourself, grow, learn, and you're showing that to the company as well. Now, being head of export controls and sanctions, it's at even a broader level of setting the direction for global business unit of the requirements, policies, procedures from the top down. So I would say when I first started out, I was very much bottom, and now I'm more at the top, setting the overall objectives. So it's a big change, but it's a good one.
So what skills did you need to learn to go from like being entry kind of level to overseeing the strategy behind an entire program? Like, walk me through, like, how did your skills need to change, and how did you bolster those areas where you just didn't have experience or exposure before?
Yeah, so I think there were some big changes there, especially coming out of law school. You're taught a certain way to think, and you don't have as much experience in the business operational side. So starting out, I was very much hired. What I figured out soon is being able to see a set of requirements and apply it to business operational, and give some guidance based on that. I felt very strong about those skills, but the skill sets I had to gain was understanding the business and how the business can interact with those risk points. Really taking a holistic view of, you're not just in a small world anymore. You need to understand the whole picture and how the business interacts. Two is communication. Even though I like to talk, and I always think that I'm good at communicating. I learned very quick how much of a skill it is to take regulatory language and try and parse it down to a salesperson, a marketing individual, procurement, into something that they can understand, and that's relevant to them. That's a skill. And that's not an easy skill that's just built overnight, especially when you're used to writing briefs in school and it's very legalese. That's not going to fly if you're in a compliance. It just doesn't. It won't work. People will get frustrated, and it's still something that I battle with. But the thing that I've learned is the clearer that I can be in that approach, the more effective I was in compliance. And that started to gain trust. And that's one thing that you have to gain in compliance is trust. And once people start trusting you, that's when you're able to build on those skill levels of actually going to them, giving them guidance, and them trusting your guidance that what they're saying, it makes sense and it's applicable as well. So I would say communication is definitely one. Seeing the whole picture is the second one, and then being a little more proactive as well. So one of the best things that my mentor told me when I first started out, I was fortunate, and he said, don't wait for me to ask. Don't wait for anybody to ask, because if you're constantly waiting for somebody to ask you about something, then you're probably not being proactive enough and either learning it yourself or going out and looking for areas of improvement.
That I think is so important, because I know even in my career, like I've hired people and they're like, well, when is everybody going to come knocking at the door for compliance? I'm like, never.
Yeah.
Never is when they are going to come knocking at your door saying, can you do something to make my life more challenging?
Right. Right.
Right? It's just like the party's not going to show up with you just sitting in your office.
Right. Right. You'll find you just won't. You won't get that. And it's not always because people don't care. It's just because it's another thing for them to worry about in the business. So you just got to be proactive in that point. And I think people will respect you as long as you make, again, going back to the communication, clearly communicating to them why this is relevant, why we should care, and very clearly indicate to them what are the requirements, what do I need to do. If you do that, they're going to respect you. If you just send them a whole bunch of jargon that they can't understand, they're going to be like, don't have time for it. So it's really honing that in.
Yeah,
Do you have any tips for making that last mile translation? So many people, as we've grown, have struggled with that transition from, for making those words resonate with people. Any advice on how to put things into business terms or take in translation into business impact, so that it resonates with them?
One thing you have to make sure they're involved in some of that communication drafting sometimes, especially if you're going to do a new policy or procedure and you're saying you guys are going to have to do this. You need to get people involved who are a part of that process to read through it, make sense of it, and tell you where it essentially sucks. And that's what we have. A lot of times we're implementing it. I'll call a meeting with a lot of the functional groups. I'm like, tell me where this sucks and be honest with me, because if we need to rip it up or change some things, the important thing, we're trying to drive behaviors, right, and compliance. So if they don't understand it, you're not going to get the impacted behavior. So I think that's one big thing that a lot of people miss. It's easy. You're doing your work. You have your initiatives, and you draft something up, and you're like, oh, this is gorgeous. Our compliance team agrees on it. It all makes sense. And you send it out, and then people are mad. They don't understand it. They have a whole bunch of questions. You're like, too bad. It makes sense to me. I don't understand what happened. A lot of times it's because you miss that one element of having the actual people involved in the process that you're trying to drive that behavior with.
Right. I mean,
That's great advice.
User experience is everything, right? And
Yeah.
if you only ask people who think like you, then you get the same answers every time.
And making people feel like they're part of the process from the get-go.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. So those are all great tips. So let's talk a little bit about specifically trade and sanctions. And if somebody was interested in entering into this, and maybe they've already got experience, like how do you enter into it or find more out about it if you're not, fresh out of school? And are there ways to enter into that profession without going from the bottom?
Yeah, I would say, and when you're looking at specifically trade compliance, there's a lot of different areas. So some job postings, you'll see companies are looking very clearly for people with 10, 15 years of experience of certain areas. So for example, in trade compliance, one of the main things that a lot of companies have to do is classify their products, because a lot of the decisions derive from classification of products. Well, a lot of companies are wanting people with a lot of experience in that area. So that's going to be a difficult area to just jump in without experience, unless you're jumping in at a lower level, just because it's such a vital part of the company, and it's a very niche area within even export and trade compliance. But other areas, if you have skills in certain aspects of whether it's compliance or investigations, you can find those avenues to kind of jump in. For example, I see a lot of trade roles that require investigations because it's a part of looking at issues within a global company. That's a huge part. So if you have investigation experience, even if it's not necessarily direct in export or trade compliance, then I think that is one area that you could potentially move in without necessarily being at a bottom level. If you're at a higher level, and parlay that, just pay attention to the job description. What is the problem the company needs solved? And if it's the problem is they need somebody with investigative experience, then you can jump into there with that. There's other areas too. IT, for example. IT is a big one. A lot of companies are realizing this. There was a recent consent agreement for Honeywell, SAP as well. IT is a huge important part of export and trade compliance now, whether it's screening partners or making sure the technical data is controlled, and there's processes in place. And I'm on calls with IT all the time, and I can tell you guys right now, like, they touch export so much that if you have expertise in the IT domain, there's areas where you can jump in at bigger companies without export specific, but being able to understand how IT systems work is a huge niche area that's needed within export. So that's another one that I would say expertise.
Expertise.
I had to laugh at that.
Oh, Dan.
So I would definitely say that area, those two areas. And then there's other areas where people are looking for policy process development, writing. If you have expertise in that area, then look at the job description. So again, a lot of it is picking out what is the company trying to solve? What problem do they have? And if you can kind of see that with the granularity, not all of it really requires export or trade experience. They want somebody who can come in and train maybe. If you're a great trainer, guess what? They're going to be less worried about your export specific experience and be more like, oh, look, this person has this great experience. They could come in, update our training program, and that's what they're looking for. So I would say that look for those areas if you're not directly in export. If you're more on the legal attorney side, then look for investigations maybe, or if you've had experience at least working in the industry, then there's other areas that touch export. So a lot of times you can combine that kind of expertise as well.
So this is great, especially as my question being on the IT side and having watched people interact with you and your counterparts, the topic of export control, similar to the topic of HIPAA or any other regulation which has significant complexities. People quickly get to the point where they think they understand the regulation, and skew to the point of overly restrictive, without interacting with the professionals that understand it truly. How do you recommend people broach that type of a discussion with somebody that maybe hasn't really got the strong understanding of the reg and not part of the field? How can you bring them around and inform them, or guide them toward, someone in your role to, to help get to the right point? Because it tends to be that they end up trying to restrict business more than is necessary.
Yeah, I think this is a common problem, especially, I mean, you're going to see this a lot in defense programs and defense contractors. They
Mhm.
were how the regulations used to be before a thing called export control reform is pretty much anything related to military was being restricted at the highest levels.
Right. Including
And
encryption, which is
yeah,
where a lot of this came in. Yeah.
and so a lot of people were controlling at the highest levels because that's how it was controlled, or obviously the risk. Some companies were, the risk outweighed opening business up more. But as export control reform happened, a lot of products moved from actually the higher controls, what most people will deem higher controls is ITAR, military defense use, to what's called more dual use restrictions, which is BIS and the export administration regulations, still controlled, which is, so you get into this kind of difficulty of people, you have a few trains of thoughts. One, people think, oh, it moved from this ITAR regulations, which is Department of State, to a more dual use side, and they're like, it's not controlled anymore. Well, that's not true. It's still controlled. But there are ways in setting up access points and understanding, what technology you're actually working with, as long as people dive into that you can come to an export compliance, for me, example, and hopefully I can disseminate, well, what is the data? What are we controlling it as? Who do we want to share it with? And really breaking that level down to seeing, okay, are we being over restrictive or not? In a lot of cases, companies, I would say, don't like, a lot of companies probably haven't gone to the level of breaking down what their actual technology controls are. And that's where you run into the big issue. If they haven't reached to that level, then you're going to be over conservative and you're just going to put everything at the highest level of restriction because you don't know. But if you actually take a process of looking at what you're doing and how that technology is controlled, then you can see, well, maybe we're being over restrictive in this. Maybe 5% of our data should be at the higher levels. So I think that's where you need to really break down what are you discussing? What is the actual technology you're working with? And then you can break down, okay, are we being too conservative? Can we be more collaborative? Because especially with, depending on what countries you're working with, there are areas where you can be more collaborative.
Right. Okay.
So, quick question for you.
Mhm.
I know there are a lot of conferences out there that talk about compliance and ethics and everything. Where do all the trade compliance people hang out? Is there are there specific conferences? Are there
Yeah.
specific webinars? Is this a wholly different crew, or is it a subset of compliance and ethics in general?
Yeah, so I see a lot of crossover. So for example, the what is it, SCCE? I always get that acronym wrong, so I wanted to make sure.
Yep.
There's crossover in topics, right? Because export and trade compliance is still a lot of making sure you have the right processes in place, the right policy in place, training, a lot of those big high level things. But there are export and trade specific conferences too. For example, ICPA is one that holds a lot of conferences every year that's trade focused. And then I'm trying to get this acronym right too. SAI Global, I believe, is another one. And then as well as the government agencies actually have some of their own as well. So for example, it's September this year, but BIS, which is what they oversee a lot of the dual use and commerce controlled products and technologies. They have a yearly update over in DC. This year it's virtual, but you go there and it's export, trade, and sanctions professionals giving, and there's breakout sessions giving you updates on sanctions, new regulatory changes, and investigation pieces and things like that, which can be interesting, hearing some of the government officials actually talk about some of their cases. So there's several different ways, and places that you can go that are export specific right now.
Very
Right.
interesting. Dan, you want to ask the question
one
that
of the
came in?
questions that came in is what specific challenges exist in this area of compliance?
Oh yeah. Well, I would say over the last 2 years, a lot of the difficulties have been especially at the end of the last administration, a lot of changes that happened rapidly. And the issue with, for China example, I'll just say it, China's been doing business in China, and especially in the aerospace and defense sector, has become very, very challenging. Same thing with the electronics as well, because of the constantly evolving area there. The due diligence side, the authorizations with the government requirements have changed quite a bit. And really the relations there, and just the way the government, for national security reasons, really wants to protect a lot of the business and a lot of the technology that we share with China. A lot of the other challenges there, they happen without some comment period from industry. So just to give an example, a lot of times they'll come out with the Federal Register and they'll say, okay, you may have 60 days before implementation, or 90 days to comment on the new changes. Several of the changes kind of happened and they were like, these are in full force now. And so if you're doing business in that uncertain time, it's kind of flipping a switch. Okay, are we prepared for this? Do we have the right controls in place from IT standpoints and training? And dealing with that many changes within a 2-year period is a lot, especially when it's coming on rapid. But I would say that's probably the biggest challenge, in terms of using trade as more of I hate to use the term weapon, but that's kind of how it was. It was kind of used as a weapon to force or protect American technology. So that's one of the big challenges that we faced recently, anyways.
Very exciting. So in terms of how things have changed, I mean, you talked about the last 2 years being very high velocity.
Yep.
Has the pandemic impacted anything that you do or how you do it?
Oh man, yeah. So
aside from just
we
doing
didn't
it
say
from
it would
home.
all be easy questions here, Jared.
Yeah. The pandemic's definitely been a challenge. I would say for a few reasons. One is being able to go to the sites and actually have that face-to-face interaction, and just discuss. A lot of this is discussion of going over, hey, these are some of the risk areas that we've seen, being able to audit on site too, and convey some of that importance has been a struggle. If we have issues, it's very difficult to not be able to see that face to face. The other thing is, as a lot of industries, aerospace and defense was hit as well, especially commercial aerospace, is you're having a lot of changes, and whether that's because of employment loss, or the business is restructuring because of COVID. And that's a huge challenge in compliance, especially if you're trying to start initiatives. Really being able to adjust to find the people who are supporting it, and making sure that we're following all the way through an implementation. If you're having a lot of change, then that can be a huge challenge. But I would say the one thing, and we discussed this before the meeting, that has been nice is, for some of those people who have been really, really busy, and normally it's very difficult to get time on their calendars, there has been the nice caveat where you've been able to set up meetings with some of these very busy individuals, because some things have slowed down, and then you've been able to have those compliance conversations with them. So definitely a challenge, but it's also come with that little carrot at the end of being able to get time on some busy executives' calendars as well. So.
Very interesting. And when you think about supply chains and everything that's going on, have there been disruptions around supply chains in general? right? Getting
Yeah.
things moved from here to there.
Right, right. And not even just COVID. I mean, I'm not sure how many people saw the Suez Canal incident,
I
but
think anybody who was paying
yeah.
attention in compliance and liked
What?
memes got to see that.
Anyone who's waiting for a product to arrive
Right.
or wants something made of wood.
Yeah. I think that's been the interesting part is a lot of it is how has your company been positioned before all of this, and you've really been able to find out how well the company has thought out of potential disruptions to their supply chain later on. If companies are single sourcing from certain manufacturers and all of a sudden a new regulation comes out, a Suez Canal issue happens, or maybe duties are raised for some reason, they figure out real quick, maybe we should have thought about this, previously or not. And what that drives down the supply chain is really, that's the strategy part of it, really shifting, okay, how do we tackle this now, but build it better and sustainable for the future? So that's in export and trade, you do get involved in a lot of the movement of the goods, but the strategy behind it as well of, really taking ownership and telling the business, hey, look, if you're going to this country to do manufacturing, you're going to have these issues. Maybe it's better to go this route. And so that's another area that you can really provide value in our world, export, trade, and sanctions, is if you can provide some good guidance and very clear on that front end so the business doesn't get caught up later on, then you can be seen as a value add. And so within compliance, it's tough to find those nuggets to say, look, I'm really helping you guys out here. But in the trade world, there really are a lot of opportunities if you're good at inserting yourself and building the relationships on the front end, that you can show value down the line of that you're helping the company navigate a lot of these issues.
Do
So
you have I guess the
go ahead.
supply chain one is one that was just really interesting to me as we watched as 3 days within, 3 days after closure of various borders and paths and lockdowns, you started to see how badly the supply chain was failing due to something very far upstream. Have you seen a change in sentiment in source, I guess, in making a more robust, less razor thin supply chain through the course of this?
Yeah, I would say definitely dual sourcing and moving to more regionalized approaches has been something that I've seen. For example, if you've constantly been shipping product to, I don't know, the US from China or vice versa, there's been a movement to regionalize a lot of stuff like that. So then if these issues come up, you're more situated to better provide help in that area. So I've definitely seen a shift, and that's been over the last even 4, 5, 6 years. Actually, a lot of the bigger companies, they've started to see the potential issues in single sourcing through the supply chain as well. Now, some are better than others at positioning, but I think there's probably a lot of companies that got caught flat-footed when COVID hit, and now they're starting to probably try and position themselves for the future. Now, obviously, there's a lot of implications to changing where you're sourcing from, especially in our area. Do you have sanctions, duties, and customs? Do you have export control issues as well? And those can be difficult to navigate. For example, the most recent consent agreement, a company I used to work at, they had issues for requests for quotes. And part of that is, manufacturing outsourced materials and exchanging technology. So that can be a hurdle that you have to jump through as well.
Great. Well, as a security professional, I love the fact that there's more resiliency and more redundancy showing up in some of those processes.
Yeah.
Not always the most cost efficient, but you can recover more quickly.
Right. And that's the one thing about compliance, right? The cost. Everybody always thinks you're asking for better systems that cost more, and so that's always a battle.
So let me ask a question. Do you know what your day, like, are your days pretty well planned and standard, or is it like a mile a minute, like all of a sudden something new's coming up? How are you staying abreast of all the different changes that are going on?
Oh yeah, that's actually a really good question. There's a lot, especially like I said, it's moved rapidly, and I've talked to a lot of people who were in the industry, dating back to the 90s, and they said there used to be hardly any changes. And so like now recently, it's just every day it seems like you see some news clip or some new regulation coming down the pipeline. I subscribe to a lot of the updates, whether it's by governments, law firms, connections on LinkedIn. You'd be amazed at how quick they get information out. A lot of them are, attorneys in the DC area, and they push
Mhm.
out. And again, that's the importance of your network, right? LinkedIn can be an incredible news source for you to constantly be getting these new updates, whether it's from the US, the UK, and European areas. So that's one way that I'm getting updated on all the changes. The other one is conferences. You're going to conferences and you'll hear how people have heard of new things coming down the pipeline, or within the presentation from governments, they'll say, hey, by the way, there's a change coming up. So I think a lot of it is just keeping your mind open, having a lot of sources, but it really relying on a lot of those connections as well. I found that really valuable to get new information, look at it, disseminate it in a summary, and then try and translate it, to the business as well.
So, what's your favorite part about the job? All of this said, what
It's
is your favorite
yeah.
part?
Yeah, and I guess this is circling back. I don't think I answered the back half of your question there. Is every day's different. It really is. Yeah, you'll have set meetings, but there's, whether it's a new regulation or somebody reaches out to you with a new question with a unique circumstance, maybe what you'll find is it's never the same, and you'll constantly get these new unique circumstances that you really get time to think and be like, oh, I can't believe that is happening that way. I've never thought of this or anything like that. It really keeps it interesting. But on top of that, there's a lot of room for creativity in this space. And I
Hmm.
think that's the thing that drew me to it is, because the regulations hadn't changed for so long, I feel like a lot of companies got placed in this complacency of, okay, we'll do this training. We don't have to update anything, make it more innovative. And now with all the changes, new technology out there, there's a lot of room to be creative with solutions, to be creative with ways that trade compliance interacts with the business. And to me, that's a huge draw. I love it. I love being able to get a little more creative than just, checking boxes on things.
Oh, that's terrific. So, we're starting to get close to the end of our time. If anyone has additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Um, but so far this has been fascinating for me. I mean, I've worked with a lot of OFAC stuff, but not as much BIS and ITAR and all of that. So I know that there's a really, really strong interest in how people can continue to become educated, how they can be qualified candidates, and what to look for in those job descriptions. Um, are there places that you look for job descriptions? Like, are jobs all on LinkedIn right now? Or are there places you should look to find out more?
It, LinkedIn has a lot of them, but I would say a lot of them have gone through ICPA too. They actually do a
Okay.
really good job. And then there's, they'll actually have a job board specific to trade compliance jobs. There's a law firm out in California that posts new jobs specifically too. It's called Jim Bartlett. If anybody's interested, they can reach out to me and I can give them that information. He posts a newsletter for trade and sanctions updates as well. So it's
Oh,
actually just
interesting.
a good source for new information on the regulations as well. Not specific to the U.S. either. So it's good little piece and nuggets of information. And then there's some consulting firms that are specific to trade compliance as well. Tyler Search is one, and then there's a few others. Again, if anybody's interested in that, they can feel free to reach out to me. I can give them that contact information. So there are resources out there outside, I would say, LinkedIn, that you can at least start to have a discussion. And then those contacts are very good, I would say, at giving insight into what are some things that maybe will make them a more viable candidate as well.
Yeah.
So that's great. I have the world's four most loaded words to ask: experience, certification, or JD.
Or all of the above. Where's option D? Where's option D?
Well, which, if you had to, in terms of somebody trying to get in there, so there's more context to the question, but is somebody trying to get into the field and grow into the field, where do you recommend they start? You talked earlier about being able to take skills that people already have in other areas and use them as the way in. Is that the preferred path? Or is that the most useful path today, or is there certification, or is it going for a degree and coming in that path?
I would say most of the people that I've seen for degrees have been, there hasn't really been one specific one. You see some poli-sci people, you see some people that were, I guess there's some master's programs for the legal side of it as well, not actually having a JD. A JD certainly isn't expected. I would say that. I see people for example, I have 2 people on my team right now don't have JDs. They have it. One of them has really, really good experience in a certain area of trade. And then another one has more of like an MBA type experience. So you're starting to see a lot of the MBA. You're actually starting to see a lot of people with MBAs come into areas that need the operational side of it, the process, the procedure, the understanding of the business. I'm starting to see that pop up a lot more than just JD specific. The JD side more has been relevant, I would say, in companies that have been in trouble. They tend to load up on JDs and attorneys. And then investigations, that's the other one that usually you'll see a lot of JDs come in. Those are the 2 main ones. Unless it's a smaller company, then they may want a JD just because they expect them to do a lot more interpretation of like the actual rules, maybe because they don't have an attorney that can help out with that specific area. But outside of that, I wouldn't say a JD is necessary for most positions within trade compliance. And most of the job descriptions you see probably won't say JD required. They may just slip in JD preferred, but most of the time they're looking for someone either who has experience in the niche area or has the operational ability to come in and accomplish, like I said, training, policies, procedures, or just understands the business side of it. So if you're trying to get in trade compliance for defense and aerospace, if you have experience in supply chain, for example, you may be a very good candidate because you just understand how things work. And that's a huge part of coming into trade compliance. You need to understand how things work. And it can take a while to really understand the nuances, especially over a global supply chain.
So experience, it reinforces your comments earlier about the value of experience and acumen.
Yep.
In being successful or getting into these roles. Excellent.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Jared. We're just about at the end, and you may or may not know, we always end all of our discussions with the same question. And because we are so heavily focused on mentoring and growth, we're interested in what's the most valuable thing you've ever learned from a mentor?
I think the best quote I was ever told was just breathe and reach. And when they said that, they meant, take a moment, breathe, just calm down, and then reach for your opportunities, reach for the new areas of learning, reach for the new mentorships, the new connections that will help you along the way. And that's been really good guidance for me of, look, like, it's out there for you if you want it. If you want career growth, if you want new opportunities, it's not easy, right? I mean, there's luck involved in some of it, right? I mean, I don't think anybody can lie to you and say there's not some luck involved in it. But by just taking that deep breath and continuing to reach, for new education, new everything, you're going to put yourself in a better position to have some of those opportunities and have eventually some of that little luck that you need in some of your career growth. So that's by far the best, and the thing that I always try and remember in anything new that I'm trying to do. So
That's great. Also helpful when swimming.
Yep.
Jared, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate all these great insights. This is a world that has intrigued me, and I learned a ton. And now I will pay even closer attention to it. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you everybody for joining us today and for your great questions. And as always, Lisa Beth, it's a pleasure to sit next to you and have these conversations.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us, Jared, and thank you to everyone who dialed in today, and everyone who will watch this afterwards. We really appreciate all of you. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Continue to breathe, continue to reach, and we'll join everyone next week, same time.